Hi there, Dr. Julian Bollider here for a short tutorial on how to hand draw urban design diagrams. The tutorial is in three parts. First, we'll do a quick flick through some examples of hand-drawn urban design diagrams. We'll consider the tools you will need and also run you through a process by which you might create your own diagrams. Okay, firstly to some examples. So I went to uni in the 90s, last century, so we used to hand draw. For many years I'd stopped hand drawing and was doing a lot of 3D modeling and Rhino, and when I had to do 2D drawing, typically using AutoCAD. It's been a hugely satisfying process rediscovering hand drawing for a book I'm working on called Business as Unusual, Alternative Dreams for Australian Cities, which is a book of entirely hand drawn diagrams comparing existing conditions in our suburbs and then comparing them to possible future conditions. So I'm quite passionate about hand drawing because I found it's the tools by which you draw really affects what you do and what you creatively can imagine. So the tools are not passive in the process of design. They very much steer you towards particular solutions, and I found the whole rediscovery of hand drawing to be very liberating. These are the kind of diagrams I've been drawing. So they are, they're somewhere between a diagram and an urban design plan. They're simple in the sense that they only ever have one colour in them, and you're not drawing everything, every little detail. They typically, I think, communicate fairly effectively for a few reasons. One is the limited use of colour, which allows you to really focus in on what it is about the diagram that you're trying to communicate. In this case, it's about a green space structure. But also the use of subtle things like line weights. So I'm using a much thicker line for the edges of buildings here than I am for cadastral boundaries. So there's a hierarchy of information which is being communicated by line weights. The other thing that can really help a 2D diagram is some shadows, which you can see here, which are lighter shadows, which are just being used to make the drawing sort of pop out and to give it that third dimension. So look, there's many different types of diagrams you can draw, but these are the current crop that I'm working on for this book, and you can see there's a kind of a similarity in the feel between diagrams, which shifts a little as you move from a kind of street block scale to a neighbourhood or district scale. Okay, so for me too, there's obviously the dilemma of, do you draw by hand on paper or do you draw using a Wacom tablet or Procreate on an iPad Pro with a Apple Pencil? I've done a bit of both. So these are all done on a Wacom tablet. I found it's okay for tracing things, but if you're actually trying to dream up new ideas or come up with ideas, that hand drawing seemed much more liberating to me. And I think it's always good when we can get out of the computer and just get back to paper, and that scratch of a pen on tracing paper I find very satisfying. But then again, I'm middle-aged, so it's probably a nostalgia thing that maybe others won't suffer from. Okay, so look, the tools you will need. And this should be said, if you want to draw diagrams like me, you don't need to draw them like me, but this is what works for me, and this is the tools I use. So I have this, firstly, the most important thing is having a grid which you can underlay your diagrams with. So this is a 1 centimetre grid, which are the heavier lines, than a 0.5 centimetre grid, which is the intervening lines. I use this Triumph like glowing tablet thing, which I got from Officeworks. They're not particularly expensive, but if you're using multiple layers of trace, it's really helpful, and so you can see through. So you need a drawing board with a grid. It doesn't need to be a proper drawing board, but it's some kind of desk with a grid on it that you can use. Pens and a scale ruler. I really like these Artline calligraphy pens, which you can get from Officeworks. I use the 4.0s, which is 4mm, I think, for shadows. Down to the 1mm for fine detail. If you're drawing on tracing paper, which is what I draw on with pens, you need a little scalpel just to scratch things. A mechanical pencil is good for just sketching out your work before you start, and a little compass doesn't hurt either. You'll need a scanner. If you're drawing by hand, you'll need to get these into the computer somehow. Taking photos is fine for certain things, but if you want it to look good, you really need to scan it. And one that can do 600 dpi. And you'll need Adobe Illustrator to process the scans once you do scan them. Okay, so the process. So typically what I do is I sketch out the diagram using a pencil. and then I ink it in with the pens. And we can see here we're going for different line weight thicknesses for a 2 or 3 millimeter line around buildings to a much finer 1 millimeter line around cadastral lots or street edges. So you're starting to assemble that hierarchy. I typically work in layers. So like this diagram you can see here, which you saw the finished version of earlier, was in 3 layers. So one is a kind of hardscape. I guess it's buildings and road edges and cadastral boundaries. Another one is shadows. And the third layer, which you can't see here, is trees. So to me, I find that quite useful in the sense of if you screw something up on one of them, then you don't need to redraw everything. And it's really much the way you would use layers in InDesign or AutoCAD or Rhino. It just helps to organize what you're doing and helps to focus you as you work on one layer at a time. I then scan it into Illustrator. So I use this scanner, but obviously most scanners will do. You want to be able to scan at 600 dpi or more, and you, in this case, it certainly can be just black and white. You don't need the shades of grey for this. Okay, this is where things get a little bit more complicated. Illustrator, I think, is the best program for doing this, but they don't make it easy for you. So what I do is I insert the image into Illustrator, which is what you're seeing here on the right image. Then you need to embed it. You don't want it linked to your original scan. You want to have it embedded in Illustrator. And then you trace it. So this is image trace, you can see here. And there's the trace settings I use. You can see here I set up my own tracing preset, which gives you really nice, crisp black lines and dark and thick lines. And you can actually then also control it using what's called the threshold here. That basically, if you lower the threshold number, you'll get finer lines. If you make it larger, they'll get larger. I typically have that around 35, not 128. Okay. All right. So then, like, obviously, you don't need to use color. So this is an optional extra. But for my trees layer, for instance, what you need to do then is, if you want to add fills to make them all green, you need to insert the image, like we just did. You need to embed the image, like the previous slide talked about. Trace it, but then expand. So you have to go to this little button up here and go expand once it's traced, and then select Live Paint, which is under Object, Live Paint, Make. Then you can just use the bucket fill tool to start filling in trees. It's good to have, I like having one color just to make the thing pop out a bit, but any more than that starts getting too much. Of course, you can color by hand and then just scan that in too, but my experience was you never got a very satisfying fill because it was always, you didn't get the kind of solid fill you can get in the computer, which is something that I really like. Okay, and then obviously there it is sort of more or less finished in Illustrator, and then I typically will then place that into InDesign, and then you can add your labels and keep things organized. So look, I guess I know overarching comment. The book I'm working on, I've got about 40 diagrams. I have blown a lot of money at Officeworks over the years on tracing paper. This isn't even all of it, but you have to be patient. Like, it will take time. Sometimes diagrams can look very simple and effective, and you think they must have been so easy to draw. But actually there's a lot of churning through endless options and endless different ways of representing things. These are all my rejects, by the way. So do be patient with yourself and take your time, put some music on, enjoy the process of drawing, and I'm sure good results will materialize if you give it that time and focus. Okay, thanks for watching.